Middlemarch is an enduring novel. It is ever relevant, despite the fact that the novel is situated in a specific time and place. It speaks to all time, and it speaks to every place, and it continues to speak to our concerns today because Middlemarch is about change. It is about reform. Political reform, medical reform, there's some artistic reform in there, and reform means change. But it's about the public versus the private sphere and the personally felt need to change or to resist change. And what we see is an extraordinary mastery of the skill of juxtaposition in Middlemarch. George Eliot making use of the serial form and releasing her episodes staggered over the long term. She has really masterfully utilised that form to establish the characters and hold them up against each other, and we see them as carrying the need for specific public reforms within them, but as they do so, they need to change as individuals on an individual level too. And so what we see is the ripple effect, how big waves are made by small movements. Different characters, they're ambassadors for different forms of change, and yet as they are pushing their desired change forward, we see them struggling in their own personal lives, and we see that the motivations for change and reform are a little bit muddied. We are social creatures, highly dependent on one another, living in a web, intricately connected to one another, and what we do affects our neighbours. And there's a brilliant moment in this episode that we're discussing today, Book 5, The Dead Hand, where Mr. Brooke bungles his speech, and poor Mr. Brooke, they raise an effigy of him, don't they? And they pelt the effigy and him with eggs, but before they do so, he tries to implore the crowd and say, we're all neighbours, essentially we're all one family, and they say, no, we're not. And that is a scene that is always going to resonate with us. If I were to say that the country today, whatever country you're in, the country or the world, let's say country though, the country is going through change, intense change. Now that would seem like that statement is going to be outdated soon. It would seem like I am making a very dated and contemporary and current statement, but it is evergreen. You can say that at any time, in any place, and it's always true. The only thing that does not change is the fact that things are always changing, whether we like it or not. And George Eliot is keen to discuss change and to have her readers live through a period of change over the long term. And by the time we've reached the dead hand, we really have met the characters, we've befriended them, they feel like old friends, and the world feels very lived in. And now we are so curious to see how things play out and how these relationships develop. And that's perfect because then George Eliot can achieve her artistic purpose. And Eliot's artistic purpose was a moral purpose. George Eliot was a moral novelist, and she used her novel, she used Middlemarch to put forward a view of society, one that leaves us better off, leaves us with more intense fellow feeling for our neighbours, sharpens our empathy, and gives us a moment to pause and to contemplate the changes that we are witnessing in the world today and the changes we are feeling personally in our own lives. George Eliot revered Sir Walter Scott and William Wordsworth for the fact that they were able to raise or make some efforts towards raising the social classes and mingling the ranks. The art that George Eliot most loved, most cherished, was the art that ended up being more effective than a sermon, indeed ended up being more effective than hundreds of sermons. For Eliot, and in her own words, art was a mode of extending our contact with our fellow men beyond the bounds of our personal lot. And Eliot really respected Charles Dickens, another heavyweight, another powerhouse, another really popular writer at the time. She respected Dickens and she learned a lot from him. She learned a lot from Dickens as a businessman, as a marketer, an entertainer, and a novelist. But she wanted to go a little deeper into achieving realism in her novels, truth. And Dickens was also a social novelist, a moral novelist, and his novels really did have a strong knock-on effect and did help affect social change, and he was incredibly influential. But George Eliot felt that Dickens was a master of the external, but Dickens would embrace sentimentalism, sensationalism, and there was something there in his novels for Eliot that didn't always ring true. Yes, he nailed the external. Now, of course, we know that in his later novels, most certainly, Dickens was able to access a much more raw and intimate part of himself and channel that into his art. But George Eliot wanted to awaken the social sympathies of her readership, and again, by this point, you're 5 books in, you are a fan. You are a George Eliot fan. If you were that first reader, you would have been responsible for helping her keep going, because releasing one's book over the long term in serial form was a really nice way of engaging with one's audience. And if you had followed the story this far, you are almost certainly going to follow it through all the way to the end. And so she has you captive, and she has this great possibility to arouse and awaken your social sympathies as long as she can convey a sense of truth. What she needed to do was craft these characters who we took for being real people. And we are the judge of the characters in this world, but Eliot is not. Eliot is very, very patient with her characters, and she does implore us to exercise that same patience, that same forgiveness. And so she thought if she could really accurately depict the inner lives of real people, normal people, then she could arouse our social sympathies and essentially reform her own reading public. And everything matters in Middlemarch, and I think it's shocking that Henry James, who was a very fine writer himself, criticised Middlemarch for being baggy and having a lot of extraneous detail that was not necessary. George Eliot herself would say, and she said this in response to Blackwood, who wanted her to excise and remove certain parts of her earlier narratives. She said, "Writing is part of my religion, and I can write no word that is not prompted from within." And in a letter in 1866, she spoke of her ideal, her artistic ideal, as getting breathing individual forms and grouping them in the needful relations so that the presentation will lay hold on the emotions as human experience. And it does feel like human experience. I can think of few other novels in which the reading experience feels like I am living in the world and interacting with these characters. The novelist who comes most readily to mind as being able to do exactly this too was a George Eliot fan, and that is, of course, Leo Tolstoy. And so George Eliot would say that there was nothing in her novel, in her work, that will be seen to be irrelevant to my design. And her design, in her own words, is to show the gradual action of ordinary causes rather than exceptional. And in that statement, we have the breath of realism. We have the growth of realism. George Eliot, who was a fan of Sir Walter Scott and those novels that were thoroughly popular all the way through the 19th century. George Eliot was moving from romance to realism. And yes, there are still tinges of the romantic in her work, but what we are seeing is an increasing concern on the part of the writer to capture perfectly the true essence of the world and the characters who people it. And these characters are characters like you and I. They're normal people. They're not extraordinary people. And that's what George Eliot wanted to capture in this novel. Other novels would deal with really extraordinary events involving really extraordinary people who don't quite seem like us. But George Eliot wanted to depict common experiences like marriage, getting married. What happens when you marry someone and you have all these ideals and these hopes for a happy life and it doesn't quite work out, and you realise that the one you married perhaps isn't the one you had in your mind. Perhaps the ideal came first. She wanted to capture the common experience of marriage. She wanted to capture the common experience of money, dealing with money. And why? Because that was how she could show an entire system growing and dependent on one another. She wanted to really convey the fact that we are all thoroughly dependent on one another and our small actions glue us together. But let's dive into discussing what's happened in this book. Book 5, The Dead Hand. Chapter 43, we see that marvellous Eliotic juxtaposition of characters. This is something we're going to see more and more over the course of the novel, how Eliot has now, she's done the hard work, she's introduced us to these different characters and established their concerns and aroused our sympathies, and we know them. Returning to this novel feels like returning to old friends, and now they're all kind of coming together, and there's a little thrill in seeing them interact. We know them, but now we are seeing how they reflect each other, how they differ from each other, but also how they don't differ that much, or at least how they are not as dissimilar as they might think. There's some really extraordinary passages where we see characters who clearly believe they are not the same as one another, but we know better. We are afforded a privileged position as reader, and we can see things as they really are, and wouldn't it be wonderful if we could do that in our real lives? And I think that's what George Eliot is yearning for. And in chapter 43, we see there are two unhappy marriages, but more unhappy people than that, because we see that Will Ladislaw is unhappy, that he can't spend time with Dorothea. And we see that Dorothea also isn't happy in her marriage to Casaubon. And we see also that things aren't going very well for Tertius Lydgate and Rosamond. At the end of this opening chapter, chapter 43, we do get a little glimpse into evergreen marital strife. And I say evergreen because these two characters, Rosamond and Lydgate, and their conversation could be tweaked and could apply to so many couples. We get a sense that it isn't a blissful relationship. This isn't paradise. This isn't happily ever after. And they're not on the same page. We start to wonder, and of course George Eliot's readers would have wondered, we start to wonder, wouldn't this character be better suited to this character? Yes, of course, we see that Will Ladislaw is completely smitten by Dorothea. Rosamond says to Will, "You are a devout worshipper." And yes, he is a devout worshipper. And we discern that Dorothea has some unconscious feelings towards Will too, that she hasn't quite at this point allowed herself to express consciously. So as first readers, we think, okay, how's this going to happen? How are things going to go with Dorothea and Casaubon? What's going to happen to Will? But perhaps we also think, wouldn't it have been better if Lydgate had married Dorothea? Aren't they more suited for each other? Towards the end of chapter 43, listen to this discussion between man and wife. It's the age-old problem. She wants money and ambition and power, and she wants sway and influence, and she wants to be respected, and fair enough. And he is working on making real change. He wants to effect real change, medical reform. He's working hard. It's that age-old problem. You need to work hard. You need to provide for us, and we need to be respectable as a family, as a couple. But also, why are you spending so much time at work? Rosamond says to Lydgate, "I am sure you do not neglect your work. You are always at the hospital, or seeing poor patients, or thinking about some doctor's quarrel, and then at home you always want to pore over your microscope and files. Confess, you like those things better than me." And Lydgate says, "Haven't you ambition enough to wish that your husband should be something better than a Middlemarch doctor?" And he says to her, "What I want, Rosie, is to do worthy the writing, and to write out myself what I have done. A man must work to do that, my pet. So he wants to be somebody. He wants to affect change. He wants to do something that's worth being written about. And she says, brilliantly, of course, I wish you to make discoveries. No one could more wish you to attain a high position in some better place than Middlemarch. You cannot say that I have ever tried to hinder you from working. But we cannot live like hermits. You are not discontented with me, Tertius. No, dear, no, I am entirely contented. So we get that little glimpse into the fact that they're not quite on the same page as one another. In chapter 44, we see Lydgate discussing the reforms needed in Middlemarch, and we get a sense of societal discontent from different characters by virtue of what they say to one another. Middlemarch shows us that the small conversations that take place all over the land, in dining rooms, in front rooms, as we walk with one another to friends and acquaintances, these are all the small ripples that will go on to exert a big effect, a big change. And Lydgate needs Dorothea's help. She, of course, needs his help. Now, we get a sense that she needs his help not only in understanding how to look after her husband, but we get a sense that she needs something more than that, not just physical help. And Lydgate is a very wise figure, but he definitely has his blind spots too. And that's what's wonderful about George Eliot's characters, is they're all egotistical. Now, that doesn't mean they're necessarily unpleasant. They're just real. And some things they do rub us up the wrong way, and other things we get flashes of brilliance here and there. They're complex, they're robust, they contain multitudes, as Whitman would say. Lydgate needs Dorothea. In fact, he needs her money, he needs her support, and he needs support generally from the town, but he makes a really perceptive comment, and this is in the Penguin paperback edition, page 439, chapter 44. Essentially, he hits upon the fact that a lot of people will vote for who they personally like. They will not see the benefit of having a certain person in a certain position to bring about a certain effect because they are the best person for that job. There is a lot of bias, and what we are beginning to see here is how difficult it is to affect change on a wide level. But we will also see that change is difficult to come about in our own persons too. So can we blame anybody for being resistant to change? Talking of Mr. Bulstrode's unpopularity, Lydgate says, half the town would almost take trouble for the sake of thwarting him. In this stupid world, most people never consider that a thing is good to be done unless it is done by their own set. And we will see that it's very, very difficult to shake homeostasis, and we'll see over and over again that characters do not want to change, and that which is already firmly established is very, very hard to disrupt, because those who are established in the system as it is and benefiting from it right now are going to be the most resistant to change, and we are also very tribal creatures. And so we won't support those who we see as not being one of us, one of our tribe. And we get a sense of second-hand frustration on Lydgate's part in chapter 45, because we see how unshakable or how unwilling to change the current medical community at this time is. Lydgate has these high ambitions in regards to the new fever hospital. But we get this rumour spreading around town that Lydgate has plans to essentially let patients die on purpose so that he can use their corpses for medical experimentation. This would have been a fear at the time, and an understandable fear too, because thanks to the Murder Act in the previous century, the 1752 Murder Act, we see that a murderer condemned to die by hanging could also have the added punishment of dissection by surgeons. And so what would happen is you'd have these murderers hung, and then their bodies were taken to the Old Bailey Surgeons' Hall and publicly dissected. And of course there were many terrifying tales of them waking up on the surgeon's table. And it's gruesome, but a lot of the progress, a lot of the step forwards in understanding anatomy were made off the back of surgeons dissecting the dead bodies of murderers. And at this time, we have this intense fear of dodgy doctors. And we see this brilliantly in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, 1818. Surgeons were seen as individuals who would go to graveyards, dig up graves and use the corpses for experimentation. Now, of course, this is not what Lydgate wants to do. He's not a dodgy doctor. He doesn't want people to die on purpose so that he can experiment on them. In fact, he's very, very sensible, and we'll see that the advice he dispenses is just really nice, common sense, unobtrusive, and erring on the side of not intervening or not prescribing medical intervention more than necessary. At this time, doctors were drug dispensers, and we might think today that there is an issue with overprescription of certain pharmaceuticals, but this is not a contemporary concern either. It's always been this way. There has always been a section of the medical community that is hesitant to intervene too much. We'll see that Lydgate essentially believes that a lot of the diseases and illnesses of the richer townfolk are due to overconsumption of drink and food, and he'll advise certain healthy remedies rather than simply dispensing drugs. Now, the medical community doesn't like Lydgate, and it doesn't help that they consider him to be very arrogant and brash. He's not trying really hard to make friends with the old guard, but we take it that they probably wouldn't accept him even if he was. And so we have all these rumours circulating, and we have this brilliant authorial intrusion on the part of Eliot, page 442, chapter 45. Oppositions have the illimitable range of objections at command, which need never stop short at the boundary of knowledge, but can draw forever on the vasts of ignorance. Now, this is a really complex sentiment, wrought in a really crisp way, but it begs rereading. She is essentially saying that if you object to another, well, you're not going to be converted to the other side and have your mind changed. Your mind is already made up. And, for example, psychological studies have shown that when we are confronted with proof that refutes our faulty or erroneous beliefs, we do not change our worldview, but rather double down on the faulty belief. We do not admit that we are wrong, and we do not admit that the other side is right, and we don't admit that there is a middle ground. We don't meet each other halfway. Our mind is made up, and it doesn't matter what another person says. If we are objecting, if we are the objecting party, we have a boundless store that we can draw on, and that store from which we draw isn't a store of knowledge, but rather ignorance. And we'll see that too, over and over again in Middlemarch. You won't read a newspaper that has the political angle that doesn't align with your mind, which is already made up, typically speaking. I'm sure some people do, but for the most part, people don't. Our mind is made up, and there isn't a whole lot we can do to persuade another to change their mind. What the opposition in Middlemarch said about the new hospital and its administration had certainly a great deal of echo in it. For heaven has taken care that everybody shall not be an originator. Now, I love that. So subtle, but so, again, endlessly relevant, an evergreen statement. These opinions are echoes. They're not original opinions. And again, how true? How true in our lives today, and how true always. What we profess or what others profess is frequently an echo. We talk about echo chambers, don't we? And we typically talk about echo chambers as being a negative thing, because all it's going to do is reinforce that same belief. Everybody shall not be an originator. So Eliot is making a wry comment on the fact that a lot of these professed opinions aren't original statements or thoughts, they're merely echoes, which means no thought has been put into them. How do you change one's mind if there isn't any thought in that mind? We say, our mind is made up. Is it made up or is it closed off? Page 444. Good Middlemarch families were, of course, not going to change their doctor without reason shown. This is an evolutionary feature, not a bug. We're not supposed to be malleable and changeable because that would disrupt our loyalty to the tribe, and we are a tribal creature. Ironically, we see exactly that in this book. One of the facts quickly rumoured was that Lydgate did not dispense drugs. This was offensive, both to the physicians whose exclusive distinction seemed infringed on, and to the surgeon apothecaries with whom he ranged himself. Now, we know, given the benefit of hindsight, that Lydgate is on the side of progress, and we'd much rather have Lydgate as our physician than some of these more firmly rooted doctors. And I think this hits home all the more when page 450 in the Penguin, we see that one of the Middlemarchers presents herself at the infirmary and essentially believes herself to have a tumour, right? And Lydgate says it's not tumour, it's cramp. And he gives her a remarkable cure. Of course, the physicians, the firmly rooted, the established physicians of the town don't like this, and we see that saving face is more important than correcting a false diagnosis. But that's quite a significant diagnosis to get wrong. Believing oneself to have tumour versus cramp, that's quite an extraordinary divergence in treatment required, and you could actually end up doing a lot more harm if you believe one patient to have a tumour as opposed to simply cramp. That medical intervention is only going to hurt, not help. But it doesn't matter to the old guard. They see him as brash and arrogant and disagreeably inattentive to etiquette, and that's the most important thing apparently. And we also have the word charlatan thrown around. Lydgate is a charlatan, an arrogant charlatan. Now, we know charlatan has the meaning of conman, trickster, someone who's lying about their skill or their knowledge, a fake, essentially. But if you look to the etymology of the word charlatan, it actually first referred to drug sellers and quacks, quack doctors, essentially. But those quack doctors who would over-dispense drugs. And so there is an irony there, an irony that George Eliot most certainly would have been aware of, that they are calling him a charlatan when what they want to do is more in keeping with the original nuance or meaning of the word charlatan. But it doesn't matter to Lydgate. Lydgate sees himself on the side of history, and he sees himself as changing the world and being someone who will be written about. One of his heroes is Vesalius. We'll see him mention Vesalius a couple of times. That's Andreas Vesalius, considered the founder of modern anatomy. He was condemned to death by the Inquisition, though he did get off. Vesalius was a stealer of corpses, and so Lydgate having Vesalius as his hero, that's not quite helping his appearance, is it, as a dodgy doctor who simply wants his patients to die so he can experiment on their cadavers. But that's how progress has been made historically. At that time, these leap forwards in anatomical understanding were born off the back of pretty macabre methods. And I also see some parallels with Antoine Lavoisier, who conducted experiments into the nature of respiration. It was Lavoisier who helped discern the fact that oxygen is inhaled and carbon dioxide exhaled. Breathing was established as an act of combustion, heating the body, and was vital to life. And Lavoisier claimed to have discovered the element oxygen. Of course, many others had laid claim to that too and had discovered it first, but he gave it the name that endures today. Lavoisier is essentially the father of modern chemistry, and Lavoisier was guillotined in the French Revolution in 1794. And so having these parallels with the father of modern chemistry who was guillotined, stealers of corpses who were condemned to death by the Inquisition, it doesn't bode well for a happy future in the mind of someone like, say, Rosamond. We see that Rosamond is at home playing the piano, filling the air with music, and Lydgate is piling up debts. And his debts are rather domestic. He owes money on furniture, for example. And we'll see that when he's at home, he's incredibly distracted. And Rosamond notes this. She notes that he's rather emotional, that he's distracted, that his thoughts are elsewhere. He's not present in the marriage. And he has Vesalius on his mind, page 457. What is absorbing you? She says. I'm thinking of a great fellow who was about as old as I am 300 years ago and had already begun a new era in anatomy. His name was Vesalius, and the only way he could get to know anatomy as he did was by going to snatch bodies at night from graveyards and places of execution. Oh, said Rosamond, with a look of disgust on her pretty face. I am very glad you are not Vesalius. I should have thought he might find some less horrible way than that. No, he couldn't, said Lydgate, going on too earnestly to take much notice of her answer. He could only get a complete skeleton by snatching the whitened bones of a criminal from the gallows and burying them and fetching them away by bits secretly in the dead of night. I hope he is not one of your great heroes, said Rosamond, half playfully, half anxiously. Else I shall have you getting up in the night to go to St. Peter's churchyard. And she tells him, you know you have enemies already. So had Vesalius, Rosie. No wonder the medical fogies in Middlemarch are jealous when some of the greatest doctors living were fierce upon Vesalius. They called him a liar and a poisonous monster, but the facts of the human frame were on his side, and so he got the better of them. And what happened to him afterwards? Said Rosamond. Oh, he had a good deal of fighting to the last, and they did exasperate him enough at one time to make him burn a good deal of his work. He died rather miserably. There was a moment's pause before Rosamond said, Do you know, Tertius, I often wish you had not been a medical man. Nay, Rosie, don't say that, said Lydgate. That's like saying you wish you'd married another man. Not at all. You are clever enough for anything. You might easily have been something else. I do not think it is a nice profession, dear. It is the grandest profession in the world, Rosamond, said Lydgate gravely. And to say that you love me without loving the medical man in me is the same sort of thing as to say that you like eating a peach but don't like its flavour. Don't say that again, dear. It pains me. Oh, dear. Okay, so it's not going very well for those two. And in chapter 46, we get a juxtaposition of Will Ladislaw and Tertius Lydgate. And they are both reformers in their own way, but it's interesting to observe that despite the fact that they are progressives in their field, prospective progressives don't always see eye to eye, because we'll see that even though they have a lot of similarities and they want to effect a lot of change, this dearly felt need to make waves in one's own realm doesn't translate to other realms. A progressive doctor, for example, is not necessarily going to hold progressive opinions and beliefs in regards to, say, art or politics. And so in chapter 46, we bop over to Will Ladislaw and we see he and Mr. Brooke are talking reform. Mr. Brooke, however, certainly seems to be playing at reform, playing at politics. He says, in typical Mr. Brooke fashion, I don't want to go too far. I want to take up Wilberforce's and Romilly's line, and work at Negro emancipation, criminal law, that kind of thing. William Wilberforce, in 1807, lobbied for slavery to be illegal in British territories, and the next year, 1808, slavery and slave trading was abolished in the British territories. Page 460, Brooke says, I don't want to change the balance of the Constitution. But that is what the country wants, said Will. Else there would be no meaning in political unions or any other movement that knows what it's about. It wants to have a House of Commons which is not weighted with nominees of the landed class, but with representatives of the other interests. And Ladislaw, being always the Shellyean figure. Eliot is keen to constantly draw our attention to the fact that Will Ladislaw is a kind of Shelley, and if you know about Percy Bysshe Shelley, you'll know that there's a connection to the world of science too. Shelley, who had a little hand in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Shelley, who made copious notes on Sir Humphrey Davis's book on the elements of chemistry. Notes that showed him as being interested in light and the life of plants, essentially photosynthesis. And so I see there's a connection there. If Will Ladislaw is Shellyean, then there's a connection to the doctor, Tertius Lydgate, and there's a connection to Dorothea, who is herself light and life. There are many extraordinary characters in Middlemarch, but the character who I believe is the beating heart, is the central character that we return to, is the light of the novel, is Dorothea Brooke. And we see Ladislaw being Shellyean in the metaphors, the sublime, romantic, poetic metaphors he draws. As to contending for a reform short of that, he says, it's like asking for a bit of an avalanche, which has already begun to thunder. Percy Bysshe Shelley, by the way, would pen a poem called England 1819, in which he wrote about rulers who neither see nor feel nor know, but leech-like to their fainting country cling. Things don't change that much, do they? We always feel discontent. We always feel a need for change in our country. We always feel like things have to change. And then we always come up against opposition where there are other people who don't want things to change that much. And Brooke says, I can't help wishing somebody had a pocket borough to give you, Ladislaw. Pocket boroughs would be a fine thing, said Ladislaw, if they were always in the right pocket. And that's the thing. That's true. If the person who has the power is good, eminently good to everybody and fair, then there actually wouldn't really be a problem. But that is the problem. You're not guaranteed that. You're not guaranteed that the people who will have the sway and the power will act in your best interest. You know whose interest they will act in? Theirs. Over and over again. And that's another comment we get in Middlemarch. People will act and vote in their own interest, first, foremost, and pretty much always. And what is Will's self-interest? Well, we see, and I think this is quite beautiful, and I think this is a really nice comment that we can meditate upon. We see that underneath all of this, underneath his poetical ambitions, his political ambitions, and I rather like the fact that Will is something of a poet-turned-politician figure. Maybe we need more of those. Underneath it all, there is a love for Dorothea. And I believe under every driving force, there is something of an expression of love. We are channeling our impulses to change the world because there is somebody who means something to us, or we are suffering the fallout from unrequited love. Page 461. It is undeniable that but for the desire to be where Dorothea was, and perhaps the want of knowing what else to do, Will would not at this time have been meditating on the needs of the English people, or criticising English statesmanship. He would probably have been rambling in Italy, sketching plans for several dramas. And we'll see over these chapters that Will continues to think about this. He thinks, I can't even see Dorothea. What am I doing here? I might as well be in Italy. I do not need to be on English soil because the only one I'm here for is her and I can't see her. So why am I here? It's quite a painful thing to contemplate, and I think it endears us to Will. Will, who is seen as a gypsy. That's what Lydgate says of him. He's a gypsy, a sort of gypsy, and there is a sense that he belongs to no class. And there is something endearing about Will, who wants to talk to everybody. He doesn't care about class. He talks to impoverished people, and he has a great love of children as well. And he knows that the little waves make the large ones and are of the same pattern. And this romantic hero is placed up against Lydgate. I like to see these characters as almost peering into a distorted mirror when they come up against each other. At the beginning, we had Rosamond and Dorothea looking at each other, and then we have Lydgate and Will, and we're supposed to see the similarities and the dissimilarities, the ostensible dissimilarities. We see that they have a little bit of a disagreement when it comes to political reform, which again, it's kind of funny that Lydgate is a little bit exasperated by the medical community and how unswerving they are, how they will not change when they need to change, and yet that sentiment doesn't go beyond his own realm. And he says, "You go against rottenness, and there is nothing more thoroughly rotten than making people believe that society can be cured by a political hocus pocus." We also get this reveal at the end of the chapter, just thrown away, which kind of implores us to reread or contemplate over what we've just been told and how Lydgate is behaving. We're told that essentially Lydgate is a little bit worried about debts. Financial issues are plaguing him. And we're told that Rosamond was expecting to have a baby, and Lydgate wished to save her from any perturbation. So she's pregnant. In the next chapter, we see that Will really wants to catch a glance of Dorothea. He wants to be near her. And he's thinking in bed. And we'll see, there's a really interesting juxtaposition here too with this chapter and the following one, because we see both Will and Dorothea, and we see what they are thinking about, what bothers them. And like a romantic hero, he's having this drama in his head, this drama between objection and inclination, and he manages to persuade himself to turn up at church to catch a glimpse of Dorothea, and he's rehearsing it in his mind a little bit. He thinks it's going to go one way, and it doesn't. He starts off so hopeful. Page 470, we see him walk to Lowick as if he had been on the way to paradise, skirting the woods where the sunlight fell broadly under the budding boughs, bringing out the beauties of moss and lichen and fresh green growths piercing the brown. Everything seemed to know that it was Sunday and to approve of his going to Lowick Church. So it's quite a beautiful image. Once again, Eliot flexing her visual powers, her ability to really paint a scene with words. And he gets there, and it doesn't go the way he had expected, and he is ignored by both Casaubon and Dorothea. They leave the church, and he walks back sadly at midday along the same road which he had trodden hopefully in the morning. The lights were all changed for him, both without and within. Notice the recurrence of the word change. Change, change, change. We see it deployed in both the personal and the public sphere. And there is a comment on the fact that they are inextricably linked. How things are going in his private life has an effect on his public efforts. The lights were all changed for him, both without and within. And in chapter 48, we see that Will turning up at the church definitely has a strong effect on poor Dorothea. Dorothea, who to me is the light of the novel. We see she's now really cognizant of the fact that she's made a mistake in marrying Casaubon. But she kind of owns it, doesn't she? And that can't be said for all of the characters in Middlemarch. She owns it. She's one of those characters who has volition, has free will, has strong opinions, has drive and desire. But we also see other characters close to her hinder her, almost like she's a child. Like she's not smart enough to make her own decisions, like she's not smart enough to stick by her actions. And that's frustrating to read too, because she does take responsibility for the things that she does. And we see that she is desiring or hungering for a fuller sort of companionship. And that hunger, we're told, had grown from the perpetual effort demanded by her married life. She was always trying to be what her husband wished, and never able to repose on his delight in what she was. Isn't that painful? That's a very painful statement there. Always trying to be what her husband wished, never able to repose on his delight in what she was. She longed for objects who could be dear to her, and to whom she could be dear. She longed for work which would be directly beneficent, like the sunshine and the rain, and now it appeared that she was to live more and more in a virtual tomb. She had such high hopes before marrying Casaubon, hopes that she would be helping him with really important work, and she realises that the work that he's undertaking isn't important, and it feels like a tomb. Yeah, I cannot help but think of the Blakean phrase, the marriage hearse, from the poem London. The marriage hearse. Seems like an oxymoron because marriage seems to be more on the side of life and birth and love than death. But marry the wrong one and you are living in a tomb. And the anxiety we see over the course of this chapter is the fact that Dorothea would carry out her husband's wishes and be faithful to him so long as he lives. But now she starts to grow concerned that his wishes will extend far beyond the grave, and he will die, and that will not free her. Till death do us part does not apply, and he's going to start to make some impositions upon her without even telling her what they are. And it's very unfair. Casaubon's not really doing right by her. He has a request to make of her, and she wants to know what it is, because there's this need of freedom that asserts itself within her, but he won't tell her. He wants her to promise to carry out his wishes without knowing what they are. And she says, well, I can't really promise to do something that I'm ignorant about. Like, what am I being bound to? Page 478, she had no presentiment that the power which her husband wished to establish over her future action had relation to anything else than his work, but it was clear enough to her that he would expect her to devote herself to sifting those mixed heaps of material which were to be the doubtful illustration of principles still more doubtful. So they're talking about his key to all mythologies. And now she pictured to herself the days and months and years which she must spend in sorting what might be called shattered mummies and fragments of a tradition which was itself a mosaic wrought from crushed ruins, sorting them as food for a theory which was already withered in the birth like an elfin child. Doubtless a vigorous error, vigorously pursued, has kept the embryos of truth a-breathing, the quest of gold being at the same time a questioning of substances. The body of chemistry is prepared for its soul, and Lavoisier is born. But Mr. Casaubon does not exactly share commonalities with the father of chemistry, with Lavoisier. She's not confident in his work and does not want to spend the rest of her life carrying out his work once he is gone, working as in a treadmill fruitlessly. But this isn't quite what he's talking about. And we feel sorry for her because, page 481, we see that it's her own mind, and to deploy another Blakean phrase, her own mind-forged manacles, her own temperament, her own character that keeps her yoked to him, her own compassion, not the real yoke of marriage. We're told she saw clearly enough the whole situation, yet she was fettered, and we're told Dorothea was weak. She wants to do right by him. She feels beholden to him. She's a compassionate soul. She doesn't want to upset anybody. She wants to help people. But she's conflicted, and that confliction and that compassion can most certainly be exploited. And the chapter ends with a sense of guilt on the part of Dorothea, a sense of guilt, and she doesn't quite want to accept the fact that Casaubon dies. Casaubon dies. And he dies before she can say to him, yes, I promise, I'll do what you say. She wishes she had said it in time so that he could have gone to the grave content, but he doesn't. And now she's left with a burden of guilt. Now, when Casaubon is referring to his wishes after death, he's not fully referring to his work. He's actually referring to a codicil in his will, a stipulation basically saying that she cannot marry Will Ladislaw. And that's going to upset Dorothea because she feels as though Will Ladislaw is owed some money from Casaubon. And we see that Dorothea is certainly not the first to know about this. It seems like everybody else knows before her. We see that Sir James Chetham says at the opening of chapter 49, "I wish to God we could hinder Dorothea from knowing this." And Mr. Brooks says all business must be kept from her. Now, these aren't bad people. They're well-intentioned, but maybe they're a little bit incompetent. Maybe they kind of bluster through life, and we think, why are you the one having control over somebody else? Why are you hindering on her behalf? Now, clearly she arouses protective instincts on the parts of those close to her, but it's rather unfair that she's put into this childish position against her will, because if we had some bad news that involved us, or we had important, significant news, would we want to be told it immediately, or would we want everyone to defer it and beat around the bush and hold it back from us for our protection? Regardless of how emotionally weak we feel, we would most likely say in pretty much every case, tell us immediately. Stop playing around. Bad news is best expressed quickly. Yeah, bad news is not made better by it being held back. And that's what we see here. We see the news being held back, and we see Dorothea being hindered. And once again, we see the effect that we have on our neighbours and our family and those close to us. And we think that we're doing good, but perhaps what we're actually doing is simply indulging our own ego. Celia, who has recently become a mother, she's given birth. She's the one that reveals that there's a codicil to the will in chapter 50, which says if you married Will Ladislaw or Mr. Ladislaw, that all the property was to go away from you. And this is an interesting moment because we see, page 490 in the Penguin paperback, that this revelation results in intense inner change. The word that Eliot uses is metamorphosis. She hadn't really consciously been considering Will Ladislaw as a mate, but we see that now that it is forbidden her, now that she really realises the extent of her recently deceased husband's jealousy, she starts to think, something in that. She was undergoing a metamorphosis. We're told that she had this alarmed consciousness that her life was taking on a new form. Everything was changing its aspect. Her world was in a state of convulsive change. Look at the word that's repeated again and again. The only thing she could say distinctly to herself was that she must wait and think anew. One change terrified her as if it had been a sin. We're told she was conscious of another change, which also made her tremulous. It was a sudden, strange yearning of heart towards Will Ladislaw. And we see that Lydgate is of the opinion that Mrs. Casaubon, or Dorothea, should know what's going on. Lydgate, he's a little bit egotistical, he's a little bit arrogant, but he's smart as well. And we see, in addition to being at the forefront of medical reform or medical change, he also does have some psychological understanding too. Let Mrs. Casaubon do as she likes, he said to Sir James. She wants perfect freedom, I think, more than any other prescription. So again, let's not prescribe. Now, they're not talking about actual prescriptions, but it is an interesting choice of words. The doctor thinking in terms of prescription, but thinking in terms of freedom over prescription. Yeah, that's where his mind is at. And again, there's something to that. I think there's something to that. To him, the pain that Dorothea's going through is only going to be compounded when these really important matters are self-repressed. But we see that it's not self-repression. Yes, we do repress things in ourselves. Yes, we are our own barriers to change. Yes, we are resistant to change. But it's not self-repression here. It is oppression. It's others oppressing us that we see. And we do see this push-pull, this tension, this relationship between us and others in society, and how we experience change, what we repress, what we don't repress, and how others hinder us or oppress us, and the fight that we need to wage not only within ourselves but within our community. And the fight within us is the fight for change within the community. And in chapter 51, we get this sense that progress is imperfect. It has to be imperfect. Will is still wishing that he was in Rome, or to put it more accurately, wishing he was with Dorothea, because he says, I might as well be at Rome. She would be no farther from me. And then we get another brilliant authorial intrusion on the part of Eliot, who says, what we call our despair is often only the painful eagerness of unfed hope. It's a nice way to think about despair. Next time you're feeling despair, see it as the painful eagerness of unfed hope. We see progress is imperfect, and we also learn that Will is actually more moderate than we might have thought. He's been aligned with Shelley, he's painted as this almost revolutionary figure, but he's a little bit more moderate than that. Brooke, referring to this idea that those occupying a property at £10 a year could vote, Brooke says, these £10 householders, now, why 10? Draw the line somewhere, yes, but why just at 10? And so it doesn't matter what the details are, because we always hear this in any realm where change is up for discussion. We always say as an obstacle to change, well, why this and not that? And Will says impatiently, of course it's essentially an arbitrary drawing of the line, but if you are to wait till we get a logical bill, you must put yourself forward as a revolutionist, and then Middlemarch will not elect you. And so he's saying, look, it's not perfect, but we can't go much faster than that. Of course, in France, revolution is pretty much always in the air and is very, very quick to happen, and things can get violent very, very quickly. And Britain is a country that is more moderate than that. The country doesn't want that quick change, that violence. Things have to progress imperfectly in a more plodding fashion, but then when we look back over history, we don't see it as a plodding fashion. We see it as dominoes, a cascade of dominoes falling. And we also see as well, by virtue of the grocer figure, the Middlemarch grocer, Mr. Mormsey, we see how difficult it is to advocate for change when things are going okay for you. That's a really important idea to keep in mind whenever contemplating change. And why is it so difficult to get things changing? Well, it's because there's a lot of people who do not want things to change, because there is a sense that, well, things are okay now, so if things change, maybe they won't be okay. And this grocer says essentially, well, this reform, will it support my wife? Will it enable her to bring up 6 children when I'm no more? So he's thinking about his family. He's thinking about what happens when he passes on. Middlemarch is concerned endlessly with life and death and what happens after we die and how those we leave behind will fare. And he's thinking about his wife and children. And so to him, his business is going okay. It's putting food on the table. So why should he be on the side of reform? How's that going to help him? What if that hurts him? And Brooke says, well, this reform will touch everybody. You've got to look at things in a family light. We're all one family. It's all one cupboard. And so he's trying to appeal to this family man. But this family man knows we're not all one family. And when one has a family of their own, their circle of concern tightens and narrows. Suddenly a lot of things that were important to you when you were younger are not as important as your own children. It's all about your children. It's all about protecting them, keeping food on the table. That's what's important. And Brooke here is essentially, by advocating reform and change, threatening that to this man who things are going okay. And if he votes one way, then maybe his customers will stop coming to him, because that's the way the world goes. And Brooke says, well, it shouldn't be like that. I'll still support you. And he says, well, that's all very well and good, but that's not how most people think. He says, I can't afford to do this. When I give a vote, I must know what I'm doing. I must look to what will be the effects on my till and ledger. As to one family, there's debtor and creditor. I should vote for things staying as they are. Few men have less need to cry for change than I have, and he's concerned with self and family. I am not, he says, and this is really resonant, I am not one of those who have nothing to lose. I think this really works as a way for helping us see the issue from all sides and sympathise with all sides, sympathise with those who advocate for change and sympathise with those who fear it, because we all understand wanting to keep our family safe. And if we see those resistant to change as being stuck in their ways and maybe unsympathetic, well, that's one way to look at it. But if we see them as family men and women, people who want to do right by their children, then we are a little bit more sympathetic, aren't we? And Brooke gives this political speech. As far as political speeches go, it's awful. He's not persuasive. And he sees this turnout, and for a moment he thinks, oh, this is going to be good. It's my own neighbours, you know. But those who turned up to hear Brooke had never thought of him as a neighbour and were not more attached to him than if he had been sent in a box from London. He gives this awful, rambling, semi-incoherent speech about machinery and machine breaking, and we get a sense that this man is certainly not the best man for the job, and we see an effigy of Mr. Brooke raised and pelted with eggs, and he himself is pelted with a hail of eggs, and he very quietly slips away and decides, yeah, maybe I need to get out of here for now. Meanwhile, in chapter 52, as we come to the close of this book, we perhaps have found ourselves wondering, well, what's happened to Fred Vincey and Mary Garth? What's going on with them? Chapter 52 opens with a quote from Wordsworth's poem, London, 1802. The poem is addressed to Milton and calls for Milton. Oh, I wish you were living at this time, Milton. We are selfish men, the poem says. England is a fen of stagnant waters. And Wordsworth cries out, give us manners, virtue, freedom, power. The one thing that never changes is the fact that we are desperate for change. We see Fred doesn't really know what to do with his life. Fred is wondering about going into the church because he can't see anything else to do. He talks to Fairbrother, and he wants to solicit Fairbrother to find out how Mary feels, because really Fred doesn't see himself as really invested in being a judge on divine matters. In fact, he sees it as being a rather ridiculous path to pursue. And so I think Fred really captures that sense of, for me at least, there's that little sense that I think a lot of people can relate to, that sense of being young and wavering and not quite knowing what to do with yourself, and maybe finding or feeling as though you're on a path that isn't quite right for you. And he's holding out hope that Mary will help him. And it's interesting because Fred is deferring authority and wisdom, life advice. He's not like some of the other men in Middlemarch. He looks to her for guidance. Now, she, on the other hand, needs him to essentially mature and grow up a little bit. She wants him to be a respectable person. She does have feelings for him, but she can't very well marry a man who her parents, for example, don't respect. He needs to make something of himself. He needs to stop being a bit of a child. He needs to mature. I could not love a man who is ridiculous, said Mary. Fred has sense and knowledge enough to make himself respectable if he likes in some good worldly business. And she says to Mr. Fairbrother, I should like better than anything to see him worthy of everyone's respect. Please tell him I will not promise to marry him till then. I should shame and grieve my father and mother. He's free to choose someone else. And that's interesting because what Eliot is doing here is what a lot of really great writers do, like Shakespeare, writers who really understand not only the human condition and how certain individuals think in certain circumstances, but Eliot, like Shakespeare, understands the dynamics between men and women in love. And she understands that frequently women will marry down, but they do not want to. They do not want to marry down. And we get this sense here of, well, who's really doing the choosing? He's free to choose someone else. Well, he's chosen you, and you have chosen him too. But you're holding out hope that the choice will be the right one, and the choice will not be made until he has made something of himself. You do love him, but he needs to be better. He needs to mature, and she's holding out for that. This book ends with something of a twist and something of a sense that there is a surprise waiting for us. We have Bulstrode and we have John Raffles end this book, and Bulstrode wants Raffles to go away, and we get a sense that Raffles has a secret about Bulstrode's past. There's something in Bulstrode's past that connects him to Will Ladislaw. Raffles mentions both a woman named Sarah and Ladislaw. And so we end this book with a sense of mystery. We want that mystery to be unravelled. We end with a sense of intense change, both in the socio-political fabric of the country, but also in the personal lives of these characters who are now very dear to us, who we know very well. And as long-term readers of George Eliot's Middlemarch, I believe we are all fervently awaiting the next book, desperate to know what happens next, desperate to keep on living in this vivid, beautifully drawn world with these unforgettable characters. Thank you very much for reading along with me. Thank you for strolling through Middlemarch and spending some time with these delightful characters. Let us know how you're enjoying the novel so far. Have a lovely day and happy reading, everybody.